Good afternoon, everyone. This is Tim Gleisner, Head of Collections at the Library of Michigan, continuing our series of talks with award-winning Michigan notable book authors. And today, for the book A Good American Family, we have David Maraniss with us. And just remember, everyone, if you want to support the Library of Michigan, the Michigan Notable Books Program, at the beginning of this episode and at the end in the credits, we have contact information for the Library of Michigan Foundation. Please contact them if you'd like to offer your support in any way. And with that, I'd like to welcome David Maraniss. David, how are you today?
Thanks, Tim. I'm doing fine. As fine as anyone can do, given the circumstances.
Exactly. No, the circumstances are definitely trying, no question. Yeah. And just for everyone you know, we did have a tour planned this summer. David was going to go to a few of the libraries. Those obviously have been canceled, so hence why we're doing the video today. And I just want to say this book, one of the best nonfiction books that I've read this past year, an era that I understood, but not quite as in depth as when I heard and read this book. Quite frankly, on the local scene here in Michigan, in the Midwest, knew about the McCarthy trials. But before we start getting into the book too much, David, I was just wondering if you could just give us some background on yourself and how did you become a writer?
Well, I was incompetent at everything else. No, it's in my blood, Tim. My father was a newspaper man. My mother was a book editor. My grandfather was a printer at Coney Island in New York.
Okay.
All of my siblings are scholars, and I was kind of the dumb one in the family, and I followed my dad into newspapers, and I've loved it. Luckily, I found something that I love to do, and so I've been doing it from a pretty early age.
That's a good thing to have. So,
I wanted to play shortstop for the Milwaukee Braves or Detroit Tigers or somebody, but that dream ended at age 12. So luckily I had something else.
Gotcha. The Milwaukee Braves, very good. Hank Aaron and all the rest. So let me ask, how long have you been writing for newspapers and where did you start?
I started in newspapers writing for the Capital Times in Madison, Wisconsin. As a student, I covered two things that later became part of my books, in a sense. I covered high school football, and later would write a biography of Vince Lombardi,
okay,
and student protests, and later wrote a book about the Vietnam era, including a protest at the University of Wisconsin. So that's how I got my start in Madison. Then I realized that Madison was such an idyllic place that if I didn't leave, I'd be stuck there forever. So in 1974, I went east and applied for jobs around the East Coast and was hired by the Trenton Times in Trenton, New Jersey. It happened to be the luckiest place to get hired then because the Washington Post had just bought it.
Wow.
So it was the Post Farm Club. And after 2 years, I was called up to the big leagues, to the Washington Post. And that's where I've been for more than 40 years.
So when you were in Madison, did you go to UW for journalism or did you just learn everything on the job?
My dad actually, along with being a writer and editor at the paper there, was also teaching a class in journalism at the university. But very interestingly, he said, Dave, don't take any journalism courses. Focus on history and English. And
nice.
That's what I did. Yeah.
As a history major, I really appreciate that. That's good. So let me ask, so you wrote a biography on Lombardi, being a good Wisconsinite. You have to do that, right, if you're a writer. And in student protest, Madison was definitely the place to do that. And you're in Trenton for 2 years. You end up at the Washington Post. That would have been like right post-Watergate. Did you get to know any of the notable figures at the Post who had been part of that Watergate?
I got there after Watergate, but Bob Woodward has been one of my closest friends for 40 years. And I was an editor with him for several years. And so I've known him quite well for all of that time, yes.
Very nice. So then I guess I just have a question about you writing for newspapers. When did you start becoming a writer of books and what prompted you to go into book writing?
I had opportunities to write a few books. over the early years of my career at the Washington Post. But I didn't feel that I'd found the right subject or was quite ready for it. Then in 1992, I covered the campaign of Bill Clinton and wrote for the paper a series of stories about his life, trying to explain him. And those stories won the Pulitzer Prize after that year. But before that, before the prize, the day of his election, or the morning after his election, I was in Little Rock covering Clinton in some sort of hellhole hotel, a motel on the outskirts of town. And I woke up at 5:30 in the morning and said, the time's right, I got to do this. I'm going to write his biography. And so I did get a book contract for that. And I've been writing books ever since.
And I mean, you're a prolific writer, so I mean, how often are you writing on these pieces? And quite frankly, what inspires you? You're in a hellhole hotel in Little Rock. I mean,
well, I saw that Bill Clinton had two things that I really was interested in. One was a fascinating life story of his life, how he came out of nowhere from Southwest Arkansas to become president. The title of the book is First in His Class, and that's the other aspect I was interested in. What was it that made Bill Clinton the first member of the baby boom generation to reach the White House? And to explore that, and to also explore his wife, Hillary, I could really write about that whole generation and sort of the stations of the cross that they faced through their years, you know, from civil rights to Watergate, feminism, all of those issues sort of went through their lives.
So you have these various topics, you have various things that you know you're exploring in all your books. Is your newspaper writing, because I mean your research in this book is prolific, and I know in other books that you've done the research is prolific. Does your newspaper writing transfer, or the research that you're doing while you're writing articles, or you know, does that transfer into these books?
It certainly was the training that I needed to do the books. I learned more writing newspaper stories than I ever did in college. It's sort of been a permanent graduate school for me. And over the years, I've learned more and more techniques, but writing a book is different. I mean, first of all, you have an ocean of time that you don't have for a daily newspaper story in particular.
Sure.
At the Post, though, I did sort of specialize in writing longer feature stories and political profiles. So this was an extension of that to some degree. And I've always had the same basic philosophy that I use in my books, which is sort of the four legs of the table. The first leg is to go there, wherever the story is, to understand the cultural geography of the place. The second is to interview as many people as I can. The third is to get as many primary documents as I can, whether those are letters or archival documents. And the fourth is to look beyond the stereotypes, beyond the mythology of what is accepted as the story, to try to pierce through that to find the real story. So to one degree or another, I've tried to use that in my reporting for the newspaper, and to a much larger degree for my books.
You know, I find that fascinating because I'll be honest with you, the part that I find daunting about this book, in a very good way, is the amount of in-depth that you go into in each character that takes place in the trial. And for anyone who's not familiar, this is based on a Red Scare trial, 1952, if I have the year correct.
Yes, in Detroit.
In Detroit, of your father, or your father was one of the subjects?
He was one of many individuals called before the House Committee on Un-American Activities.
But I mean, you're researching subjects in Detroit, people who are from Virginia, I mean, across the country. Are you going to those individual places? Because I know at the end of this book, you mentioned, I drove out to Virginia one day to go see this man's home and his gravestone on the edge. I mean, are you literally doing that for each of these people?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. You know, the Virginia is it's the counsel for the House Committee on Un-American Activities, who lived out in the Shenandoah Valley, which is only 2 hours from where my Washington house. I spent a lot of time in Detroit and in Ann Arbor, particularly because The Bentley Historical Library, which you're probably familiar with,
Oh, yeah.
is a wonderful treasure trove of documents. And because my father and my uncle, who's also a figure in the book, who fought in the Spanish Civil War,
Yes.
were both graduates of the University of Michigan, that Bentley Historical Library had a lot of material on that whole period and on them. Um, so a lot of time there, a lot of time in New York, where the Tenement Library at NYU has all of the documents on the Spanish Civil War, and also much on the McCarthy era. And yeah, so I went to Spain. That was part of it for the Spanish Civil War aspects of the book,
Okay.
because so many veterans of that war were later called before either the McCarthy hearings or the House committee hearings.
Because
For that.
they were
Yeah.
fighting on the side of the communists
Well, yes, and also on the side against the fascists.
against the fact.
Another, many of them were communists, many of them were not. Um, but they were all fighting against Hitler and Mussolini and Franco and the whole fascist movement in Europe at that time.
So let me ask, I mean, this is obviously a very personal book because of your uncle, your father. You go into a lot of background on your mother's side of the family, your siblings. How long has this book been germinating with you? I mean, how long have you been thinking about writing this story?
I can answer that in two ways, Tim. It's probably been in me my whole life, but it wasn't until the last 10 years, and especially after my parents were gone, that I really became obsessed with finally doing it. And there was another sort of trigger to it, which was I had done these books about biographies of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. And in both of those books, there's a difference between biography and memoir, or there's a difference between what a biographer finds and the traditional stories that are passed along from a family, right? So in explaining each of those books, I'd say, well, most people pass along the myths of their family, but they don't have a biographer going back to find out what really happened.
Mm-hmm.
It's true of all of us. We hear family stories. And I would say that enough, especially with the Obama book, because there were differences between his wonderful memoir, Dreams from My Father, and the reality of what I found in the biography.
Okay.
But the differences mostly had to do with stories that he'd been told that he didn't have a biographer's mind of trying to find out what really happened. So when I'd explained that, I thought, there's a really almost hidden story in my own family, and I'm a biographer, and I should go back and find out the real story. And that's what really drove me to this book.
So let me ask, I mean, because this was a very trying time for your family. I mean, your
Yes.
father literally traveled around the country after the effects of this time because of the FBI and their investigation. I mean, continual checking up on him. I mean, I was very struck in Iowa and Wisconsin, but how much of this story did you know before you went into it?
I knew the outline of the story, but I didn't really know the story at all. My father and my mother did not talk about it much at all. And it was a subject that I knew they were so sensitive about because they'd survived that period. They'd thrived and moved on and had wonderful careers after that. And it was in their past. They didn't want to focus on it. And so I honored that while they were alive. But I knew it affected them, and it affected me. I mean, I was 3 years old when my father was blacklisted, and we, as you said, we moved around the country for 5 years after that, as he would bounce from job to job, and the FBI was tailing him. And so it clearly had an effect on me, and even more so on my older siblings.
Sure.
So, I knew about that, but I didn't really know the depths of the story until I started reporting it.
So how hard was it to conduct that research? I mean, you talk about interviewing people. Were you interviewing family members? And you obviously were traveling to these different places, looking at papers and different archival, collections. how hard was it to conduct that research on your very own family?
To the extent possible, I tried to treat it as any of my other biographies.
Okay.
I mean, obviously it wasn't, but that's the methodology I tried to use. The real key to the book came very early in my research. I went to the National Archives in Washington, where I live, and all of the records of the House Committee on Un-American Activities had been opened by then. And I knew from what had already been public was a transcript of those hearings. Every congressional hearing has a transcript that's published by the government. And I read that years before, and I knew that at one point in those hearings, my father, who refuses to testify against himself or any of his friends or acquaintances, says that he has a letter he wants to read about what he thinks it means to be an American, as
Right.
opposed to what the committee was saying. And he wanted to read that letter into the record. They wouldn't let him. And so it was filed away. And when I went to the archives, I was hoping that it might be there, but I really didn't expect it. You know, I thought it was lost to history. And there was a file on those hearings in Detroit and one file on my father. And when I opened it up, there was that letter that he'd written
Wow.
on March 12, 1952, explaining himself. And that letter was very powerful. When I saw it, it was a very powerful moment for me and really drove me through the rest of the book.
And your father, I mean, he was a veteran. I mean, this is a man who was a U of M graduate. I mean, he definitely embodied many of the virtues of being an American, but here he was on trial. Can you explain what brought him to that point in his background? What was it that?
Well, what brought him there, and I don't mince words about this, was that he'd written for a communist newspaper in Detroit.
Okay.
He'd been radicalized at the University of Michigan in the late 30s, which for those of us who were in school in the late 60s, it was kind of comparable. You know, it was a radicalizing experience for thousands of people to go through those two periods. In our case, it was because of Vietnam and because of civil rights, largely. In the 30s, it was because of the rise of fascism in Europe and civil rights then too, and also the burgeoning labor movement in Michigan. All of those things were radicalizing moments. So my father had that history, and you know, as you said, there are a lot of different characters in the book. One is a woman named Maraniss Baldwin, who was.
I'm sorry, she stuck with me.
Oh,
I had no idea what the FBI was doing with plants, so I apologize. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
well, that's fine. So she was recruited by the FBI in the early 1940s to infiltrate the Communist Party of Detroit and then of all of Michigan. She rose through the ranks, becoming the secretary. And then in 1952, 8 years after she'd joined, entered into that sort of secret life, she came in from the cold and testified at the very hearings where my father was called. And she named hundreds of names that she accumulated over many years. And my father was one of those names. And so that's what led him to be called to the committee and led to his firing.
That's the fascinating part for me is just, well, this woman, I remember you described her as just really a grandmotherly type. I mean,
Yes.
she was, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, no, the newspapers described her as the grandmother spy. She just had her first granddaughter when she was called. She was 49 years old. She was not a disillusioned former communist as many informants were. She didn't really have any politics, which was probably served to her advantage as she got into this role. But she was paid. She was a paid informant, and that was her job. And so, yes, there were several of those around the country.
So can I ask, something that always struck with me with your book was Detroit the only city they were doing outside of Washington, D.C.? Were there other trials
Yes,
around the country at the same time?
there were over the course of those years, yes. Detroit was chosen for one reason that anybody in Michigan is familiar with, and that's the United Auto Workers, which had a socialist and communist element in that labor union at that time. And it was a target for the committee and for McCarthy. There were similar hearings held in Cleveland, in Chicago, and a few other cities, New York, Los Angeles, obviously because of Hollywood, the famous Hollywood 10 and the investigations out there. So Detroit wasn't alone, but they picked certain targets, and labor was one target. And if you're going to go after labor, you go to Detroit.
One character that stood out to me, and you did obviously a lot of research on his early life, and he's a notable Michigan character, is Coleman Young figures in
Yes.
this trial. Can you explain a little bit of Coleman Young?
Well, Coleman Young was a labor organizer in the 40s. You know, he had also served in World War II, like my father, in the Air Force, was an officer. And he came back and was a labor organizer. He was not a communist, but he, as many, especially African-American civil rights activists of that era did, they were not embarrassed to affiliate with communists in the cause of civil rights. So he was called before the committee with the same week as my father.
Hmm.
And Coleman Young, unlike anybody else who testified, sort of blew the committee up. He was fearless. The chairman of the committee was a Georgian, a former member of the Ku Klux Klan, you know, which is, of course, a great irony right in and of itself, trying to find out who's un-American. He could look at himself.
Right.
And the committee counsel, who we'd mentioned earlier out in the Shenandoah, from the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, Frank Tavener, was also a Southerner. They both had Southern accents and Southern ways of talking in which they would say the word Negro so it sounded like something else. And Coleman Young just blew up when they said that. That's not how it's pronounced, he said. And he took the offensive for the rest of the hearing when he was called before the committee. And it was really his performance before that committee that propelled him into his political career, including becoming the mayor of Detroit. He said that after those hearings, he would walk through Paradise Valley and Black Bottom neighborhoods of Detroit like he was Joe Louis coming home from a fight, because he'd stood up to those Southern crackers, people would say.
Amazing. That is amazing. So Detroit and Ann Arbor, how important are they to this book? As community?
They're at the center of the book. They truly are. That's where my parents met at the University of Michigan. It's where they formed their politics. It's where my uncle and two other of his classmates left the University of Michigan to go fight in the Spanish Civil War. And it's where my father worked at the Detroit Times. It's where we lived during a period of his blacklisting. So I was there for most of the first 7 years of my life, very formative for me, and really for my parents.
Wow. So how would you define this work? I mean, you talked about the difference between memoir, biography. Yes. Is this more of a history? I mean, how would you define this as the author of this work?
I think it's unavoidably, because I couldn't write it without using first person, which is the first book where I've done that.
Okay.
But so to that degree, it's somewhat of a family memoir, but it's a hybrid. It's really a history. And as I said earlier, I use the same methodology I use in all of my other books. So it's a combination, but mostly it's a history using my family's experience as a way to illuminate a larger story.
So you said you knew parts of their story, but what part of the American story and Michigan story, what part of that story did you learn from writing this book? And I'm sorry, because I'm fascinated by the book.
No, sure, totally. I mean, I learned all that. Well, I'll give you one small but vibrant example. I learned what a fabulous newspaper the Michigan Daily was in the 1930s.
Okay.
Truly, stunningly sophisticated, more so than any student paper I've ever read, and probably more so than most of the establishment newspapers in Detroit or anywhere else. Um, you know, it had this incredible cast of writers, including Arthur Miller, the great playwright,
Mhm.
um, John Chardy, the poet, John Malcolm Brennan, the poet, um, my father, who was an excellent writer. It dealt with politics. It dealt with books, and all of culture in a very sophisticated way. And I had my mind blown by reading um, uh, years worth of the Michigan Daily during that period. So
Did
that's one small thing.
Did you know anything about that paper before you went into this? Have you heard about it or?
Well, I certainly knew about the Michigan Daily because I have colleagues at the Washington Post who came up through that.
Okay.
Much later, though, so I didn't know about its excellence during that 1930s period.
Very nice. Very nice. Anything else that you learned about the American story from this book, from the research on this book?
Oh, I learned so much, Tim. I mean, as I was writing it, um, I probably went to the archives a month before President Trump entered all of our lives by writing down that golden escalator. And, there were so many echoes of history as I was writing it, from the present to the past. Um, the demonization of others as in terms of political manipulation, um, the uh, the use of you know language for manipulative purposes. In that era, it was pinkos and commies. In the Trump era, it was Muslims and um, Mexicans, or immigrants, illegal immigrants. No human being is illegal. Um, so the echoes of that period just sort of reverberated as I was watching what was going on today.
Can I ask you, what was the hardest part of this whole experience writing this book? What was the most?
Well, I think the hardest part was um, keeping my eyes wide open to my father's missteps, not so much in terms of his personal life, but in terms of his politics. Reading, for instance, a very well-crafted argument about something that was indefensible, like the Soviet Nazi pact in 1939. That was hard for me. I
Sure.
was saying, come on, Dad, what are you thinking? I mean, but people see what they want to see. And what got me through all of that was an understanding that my father learned and grew from that whole experience. And he did so in a way that didn't leave him pessimistic, or he didn't turn into a hard right neocon like some former communists did. He kept his idealism, but he also was alerted and awakened to the dangers of falling for any rigid ideology. And that's what he taught me. So when I knew where he came out, it made it somewhat easier for me to see what he'd gone through.
Okay. So you write all these books and you've written quite a bit. Is there anyone in your family, or is it just over at your publisher, who reads your work before it gets submitted? Is there someone who's going through and saying, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense?
Sure. Um, when they were alive, it was my parents, who were wonderful editors and had very different
Really?
perspectives. I mean, my dad was kind of the hardcore newspaper guy, and my mother was a book editor. And so, sometimes for my first two books, I would send them copies, and then they'd get on the phone and they'd be arguing between themselves for like 10 minutes about some grammar or some other thing that was in my book. And I'd just be listening, enjoying their conversation.
Sure.
But for all my books, my wife is my first editor and reader.
Okay, very
Um,
good.
yes.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. You were gonna.
And I also, for each book, find people who are experts in that field or familiar with the topics I'm writing about to read it so that I can make sure to the best extent possible I'm not making any stupid cultural mistakes.
So let's talk about the title, Good American Family. What's the significance of that title for you? Why is that?
Well, the title, first I'll say where it came from, which was from a Michigan person who happened to be on the committee, Potter, a congressman from Michigan. As I was researching him, and he's another figure in the book, I found a speech he gave where he said he was dumbfounded by the fact that anyone from a good American family could be attracted to the Communist Party. I read that and said, I came from a good American family. I am part of a good American family.
Right.
And so that's what inspired the book. I mean, the title.
It's a wonderful title. So with this work, what do you find the relevance of this work with today, the current situation that we're in?
Well, as I said, I mean, it has to do with the demonization of others and the use of that for political purposes. There's also a sort of an eerie connection between Joseph McCarthy, who's the shadow of this book, and Donald Trump, in that McCarthy's top aide was Roy Cohn, who was also a mentor of Donald Trump. And the manipulation of truth and fact. You know, McCarthy got his start by saying he had here in his hand the names of 305 communists in the State Department. He didn't. It was, you know, he was just saying that. And unfortunately, we have a president now who, according to my own newspaper, the Washington Post, has now accumulated 20,000 lies over the course of his presidency.
Chilling. So, of this book, what are your favorite characters or pieces of this book? What is something that stuck out with you? Obviously, your father and your mother.
You know, just in terms of, you know, I love the research where I'm at some place that evokes history. And so even though it's only one chapter, but a very important chapter in the book, going to Spain and retracing my uncle's travels there when he was fighting in the Spanish Civil War, the battle sites along the Ebro River, being in the exact places that he was in 1937 and 1938. That was a very powerful, moving experience for me. And what was interesting was two things. One is that so much of those parts of rural Catalonia where many of the battles took place are virtually untouched 80 years later. The remnants of the battles are still there, the pockmarks in the walls, the churches and other buildings that were bombed by Hitler's Condor Legion, you know, when they were practicing for what would come in World War II.
Sure.
Ruins are still there.
Wow.
And the single most powerful moment, one of the three Michigan students who went over there, along with my uncle, was a student named Ralph Nefas. And he was captured by Franco's troops and held in a church, a cathedral, in the town of Alcanese. And my wife and I went there and walked into that church. He and the other captors were killed, executed by Franco's troops. And when we walked into that church, all those decades later, it still felt like a dungeon of death. And that was an incredible, moving experience.
And I mean, really, in the Spanish Civil War, there were thousands of Americans that went across the ocean to fight in that war, right?
There were 3,000 plus Canadians. And they, you know, it was all for idealistic or ideological reasons. It was against the law for an American to fight in a war that the United States was not involved in. So they all, had fake passports, went across to France, then took trains across France and climbed over the Pyrenees to go down and fight in that war.
And let me ask you, and I know this isn't something you mentioned, but I had asked earlier, and I'd just like to revisit. You mentioned Detroit is central in this book, but this isn't the first time you've written about Detroit. Uh, What is it about Detroit, the city, that fascinates you,
Well, partly that I was born there,
David? Okay.
partly that I find it such a symbol of America's promise and failure to meet promises in different ways. But my other book, Once in a Great City,
Yes.
was really a focus on what Detroit has given the world, which is an enormous amount. The labor movement,
Mhm.
uh, very central to the civil rights movement. A lot of the support and money for what was going on in the South came from Detroit. Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech in Detroit before he did in Washington.
Right.
Cars, obviously, the automobile industry, which is such an American thing,
Sure.
and Motown, the music of the soundtrack of my generation, the great music from Detroit. So I wanted in that book to write about all of the wonderful things that Detroit gave America, to remind the country what it owed that city.
So let me ask, I mean, like from all that research, and you've gone into exhaustive research in this book and the other on Detroit, is there something that surprised you about that city? Because I'll be honest with you, Detroit is a fascinating place for myself as well. So is there anything that ever stood out to you about Detroit? Again, didn't know anything about, or?
Oh, there's so many things, Tim, but I'll just give one example. Like, why did Detroit produce so many great musicians? And I was trying to figure that out. What was the spark of Motown and all of that? And I discovered that a large degree you could attribute it to two things. One was it had this fabulous music store that provided pianos and music for everybody in the city, that the people of Detroit in that era, black and white, had some disposable income because of the jobs in the auto industry. And that the most important factor of all were the music teachers in the Detroit public schools.
Really?
Every musician I interviewed remembered who their music teachers were, in elementary school and in high school, whether it was Cass Tech or Northern or whatever school
Sure.
these great musicians went to. And they all said that that was a formative factor in the wonderful music that came out of Detroit. So I learned that by my research.
Fantastic. That's awesome. I never even knew about that. So let me ask right now, with everything that's going on in the country, how is the current situation affecting your work right now or into the future?
Well, for the last 4 months, I've been in this very office, which you see on the screen.
Okay.
The truth is that everything's changed, and for me, in some ways, it hasn't changed. Because, I'm in this office. I would probably be out researching my next book, going to the places of that book, including, my next book is a biography of Jim Thorpe, the great Native American
Sure.
athlete. And I'd be going to Stockholm, where he won in the Olympics, and to Oklahoma, where he was from, and various places of that book. I haven't been able to do that in the last 4 months. So I've been in this office. Basically, I would say this book is the best organized book I've ever had, because I've spent 4 months going through my voluminous research from so far and
Right.
organizing that. So that's all changed because of what's going on. I actually, even though I still have much research to do, 2 weeks ago I started writing the book.
Well, okay, so I have to follow up with that. I mean, I get why A Good American Family or Once Upon a Great, American City. Why Jim Thorpe? I mean, I know who he is and he's a fascinating character, but how did you settle on him as your next book?
Well, I've written books about sports figures before, Lombardi and Roberto Clemente,
Okay,
and Rome, the 1960 Olympics. So it's part of what I do. But in each of those books, I'm looking for something beyond sports, a way to illuminate the world through that story.
okay,
So for Lombardi, it was about the mythology of competition and success in American life, what it takes and what it costs. For Clemente, it was the role of Latinos in the American culture, sort of a migrant worker going to Pittsburgh and making his way there. Um, for Rome 1960 as a way to illuminate the whole world at that moment of those Olympics. And for Thorpe, it's a way to write about the Native American experience from the course of his life, which went from the 1880s to the 1950s. For much of that period, the government philosophy about Indians was kill the Indian, save the man. In other words, try to get all of the Indian culture out of these people so they could survive.
sure.
It's an incredibly condescending and ill-fated effort. But Thorpe had to deal with that his whole life. And so that's one of the many ways that I can write about the American Indian experience through his life, along with all the fabulous sports. He was a rare figure who, won 2 gold medals, was one of the founders of the National Football League, a fabulous All-American football player, and also played Major League Baseball. So so there's a lot of sports material to write about to help tell that story.
Fantastic. So you got selected as Michigan Notable Books author again. What's it mean to you to become a Michigan Notable Books author?
Well, I have a few hometowns or home places, more probably than most people. I mean, Washington, Madison, where I grew up mostly, and Michigan and Detroit. So I feel a strong connection to Michigan, and it means more to me because of that.
Very,
And also because Michigan has a wonderful literary history.
very nice. And then finally, why do you think people should read this book? What's important about this book? And you've already touched on a lot of it.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that, the famous Faulkner quote, the past isn't dead, it's not even past. And then the Santana, if those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. I mean, this is history of a very important era in modern American life, which has echoes even through today. And so I think it's a way where you can dig into a fascinating personal story that also illuminates something larger.
Well, thank you.
It's relevant today.
Thank you, David, and thank you for being with us today. And thank you to all for listening to our latest Michigan Notable Books installment with David Maraniss, author of A Good American Family. Again, if you wish to support the Michigan Notable Books program, please go to the ending or opening credits of this segment and find contact information for the Library of Michigan Foundation. David, thank you so much for today. And it was a real pleasure talking to you, and thank you for sharing this book with the world.
Absolutely, Tim. I really enjoyed talking with you, and I love what your library does.
Thank you, sir, and have a good day.
Okay, you too.